This is We Bleed Orange and Black, the podcast for Halloween and horror lovers. Join us as we interview creators, discuss our favorite horrors, and share original spooky stories. I'm Jeff C. Carter, and this week we're talking with Kevin Bachar about his new collection, Dread. Kevin Bachar is an Emmy Award-winning documentary director, WGA screenwriter, and member of the Horror Writers Association. In 2022, Lionsgate released his film, The Inhabitant. His next movie, El Monstruo, is currently in pre-production. Welcome to the show, Kevin.
Thank you, Jeff. How's it going?
It's going all right. I have an icebreaker question for you.
Okay, shoot.
If swimming with sharks is your day job, what do you do for fun?
Actually, swimming with sharks is fun. I actually enjoy it. It's kind of why I do it. I mean, for our audience listening, that's part of what I do. I make these documentary films for National Geographic or Discovery Channel. If you've watched Shark Week or Shark Fest, you've seen my work. It aired on those channels on Discovery and National Geographic over the last 10, 15 years.
How does one get into documentary filmmaking?
You know, it's sort of like any job. You start off right at the beginning. It's sort of like you send your resume in and hope they say yes. I started out as what's called a PA, a production assistant, which is where you do everything. You carry gear, you pick people up, you drop things off at FedEx, and you work your way up. Even if you went to college for a degree, and I was going to college for a TV and radio degree, I actually left early because I got a gig in the business. And it's sort of like, wait, I'm in college to get a job. I've been offered a job. So I left college. But even if you come out with a degree, you're starting as a PA. You start at that lower rung.
I can confirm that. Carried a lot of sandbags, set up a lot of C-stands, got a lot of coffee, got yelled at.
Yeah, you speak from experience.
Yeah. Were you specifically going to school for documentary filmmaking? It seems like documentary is a ring within a ring.
Yeah, you're right. I grew up in Queens, New York in an apartment. And when I was a kid, the National Geographic specials and shows and the magazine, I lived for that because it kind of took me out of this world of asphalt and subways and concrete. And so when I had a chance, I kind of was looking to get into the documentary world. That nature always kind of fascinated me. If I could, I probably would have been a biologist, but that was just too much work.
You don't work your way up from being a PA to a biology degree.
Yeah. I mean, you forget there's a lot of math in biology. I mean, if you read anybody's paper, statistics is a key component to writing papers on biology and in terms of animals and statistics and so forth. And that was never going to jive with me. So when a job opened up at National Geographic, I threw my resume in there and haven't looked back.
I saw that some of your projects were determined recently by the writer's strike. How did that impact the documentary world?
It didn't impact the documentary world because I'm this hybrid. I write scripts, I write short stories, but I also produce and direct documentaries. The producing and directing is not affected by being in the WGA. I'm still able to produce and direct. I can't write those projects, but I could produce and direct. So I was able to still work on the documentaries, even though the strike was going on. But it did keep me from working on scripts, selling scripts, meeting with producers and all that for a long period of time, which got me into writing the book. It's sort of using that downtime efficiently.
Are making documentaries and writing fiction different passions, or do they overlap in some way? I
think they overlap because it's all about telling great stories. It's all about reeling an audience in. And now, if you remember any of the great documentaries you've seen, it's about great characters, great stories. There usually is a beginning, middle, and end, just like any sort of fiction story. I've been fairly successful in the documentary world because I do approach my documentaries in that manner. There's a hero, whether it's a biologist or an animal, and we're going to follow them along their story. And there's going to be situations where that biologist's experiment fails, and they have to redo it, and they then have to try again, and oh my God, the weather or something else comes upon them that makes it difficult. And this is all real life. This is how it is when you're working out in the field. I look at it and try to give that hero's journey to the documentaries I work on, as well as, of course, the fiction I write, whether it's novels, short stories, or screenplays.
The book we're talking about today, your collection Dread, is 22 short tales. Are these all the little nagging fears that whisper in your ear when you're out on location? How much of this comes from experience?
A lot of it was sort of based on experience or moments that I've experienced, and I sort of give it that horror twist and and took it a little further, then of course what happened. There's a story in there about a woman on the tundra being tormented by mosquitoes and how she eventually fights that terrible itch. And that was based on a real event where I was in Greenland, and it was in June and the mosquitoes were swarming, and I came upon a woman in this remote camp who just was not equipped to battle the mosquitoes, where you have to have like the full head net on and tons of bug spray on and gloves on your hands, because they will eat you alive. And she was being eaten alive. And we ended up having to give her like our backup head nets and backup gloves and extra bug spray, because she would have went mad from the mosquitoes. So that sort of gave the impetus to one of the stories in the book. So yes, a lot of those stories came from real experiences or real moments.
That particular story, The Itch, is one of the ones I had highlighted to talk about because it was so visceral and so disturbing.
Thank you. That it worked, but thanks. I'm glad you enjoyed it.
The progression of the gathering clouds of mosquitoes that become a fog.
There were fogs and like clouds of mosquitoes. I mean, literally, like it was like a mist, because especially in that area, the tundra that melts and it forms all these pools of water, and it's standing pools, and they're just mosquito breeding grounds, and you'll see caribou get driven almost insane from the mosquito bites, just gorging on them. I just took that to the next level.
So you include a lot of factual information about nature in your stories, and there's a lot of hands-on detail for operating in each specific environment. I found that really grounds your stories in reality, but it also helps establish the scene. If you're on the ice floe or if you're in the deep woods, all of the rich detail that you bring to it about the gear or the best practices. You have a story about a guy trying to cross Death Valley. There's a lot of know-how that goes into that. It can go so wrong so quickly.
Again, that was born out of working in those environments. I mean, I've been in the middle of the desert in Egypt and other places, and if you're not prepared, it could go from pleasant to horrific very fast. In Death Valley, in Utah, and other places where they went out on a hike, and in a matter of hours, they were dead. It's just one of those things people just don't think about it. And the temperatures that I mentioned in the story are real temperatures, 130, 134.
That character is arrogant, obviously, to attempt a hike through Death Valley, but he has all of this experience from other environments, other challenging, brutal excursions he's taken, and then almost immediately his boots start melting. And that just doesn't happen anywhere else. But a place like Death Valley, where the gear you're relying on to keep you alive is literally melting in front of you. I remember reading, I think it was Lost City of the Monkey God. There were these different expeditions going to the Amazon in search for this missing city. At the British Explorers Club, one of the explorers was someone who had conquered the Arctic. He thought he was truly invincible. He wanted to go along on this excursion to the Amazon. The guy who'd already been there was like, "You're not prepared for how brutal the Amazon is." And he's like, "Well, I have faced the white hell of the Arctic. That guy just didn't last when he hit the Amazon. It was so much more insane than he could have imagined."
You are 100% correct, because I've had the opportunity to shoot on the glaciers of Greenland, just miles from the North Pole, doing ice coring, and above the Arctic Circle, filming moose in Sweden, filming the Iditarod in Alaska, like really cold, minus 50-degree temperatures. And I've worked in the desert, as we already discussed. The jungle is the worst. I mean, I've shot in Amazon, and there is nothing worse than the jungle. Everything in there is made to repel you and hurt you. There's stuff called fire sap, which if you touch the sap, it'll burn you. There's this thing called black palm, these trees that literally have like needles sticking out, that if you reach for them, they'll go through your hand, and they're barbed, There's every manner of venomous creature, from fer-de-lance to bullet ants. They're called bullet ants because the venom feels like you got shot by a bullet. There is nothing that compares to the jungle.
Green hell, they call it.
Yes, exactly. Green hell.
Not all of your stories are specifically grounded in animals or environment. You have a few whimsical tales like The Starter and
Yes.
Branching Out that I also wanted to touch on because they not only stuck out as being different from the others, but they were just really novel and compelling. Tell us a bit about The Starter.
There are these stories that look at nature gone awry, and then there are ghost stories and monster stories. There's this mix, and The Starter is kind of a monster, I guess, or I don't know how would you categorize it?
I would call it creature horror buried deep in the real life horror of trying to start a small business.
Yes, and that's what it is. It's about a pizza guy, and he's in competition, and he's wondering why everybody's going to the other pizza place and not his, and he kind of finds out why. And I don't want to give things away, but there's a cost to the secret that the other place has, and that he ends up incorporating in his own pizza. So he gets what he wants, a very successful business, but there's a tremendous cost, and there's going to be a cost down the road that's going to continue to keep this success going. Let's leave it at that.
That story feels inspired by your time in the urban jungle.
Oh, yeah. I'm living in New York now. I grew up in Queens. And there's a pizza place on every block, and all of them attest to be the best. And you better be doing something to stay in business, because all you got to do is walk a block and get another slice.
The other story that I wanted to mention, Branching Out, feels like it's on the border of the two. It feels very suburban. There is a tree at the center of the story, but ultimately it's about your lawn, it's about your property, your privacy, your relationship with your neighbors and community.
Yeah, and it's a ghost story as well, and it's about kind of an old cantankerous guy whose lawn is being taken away because he kind of lives on this hairpin turn, and people keep tearing up his property, and eventually somebody hits a tree on his property and dies. And this, which we see all the time, this makeshift memorial comes about. At first he's tolerant of it, but then he starts to get annoyed. And I drove by a place one day and saw that exact same thing. It was somebody's lawn. It was this massive tree, and there were all these wreaths around it and candles and stuffed animals. I understood it, but then I also looked at it from a homeowner, or how long do you allow that? Because it's not a great thing if you're thinking about it, coming out every day, going to work or taking the garbage out and having this reminder that somebody perished on your front lawn. So that was the impetus for the story and what happens to our main character.
The character you chose, Hank, is such a great fit. If he has a motto, it would be "Get off my lawn." But you understand why, because the intersection in front of his house is basically a demolition derby of cars flipping and crashing into each other all the time. That may sound far-fetched, but my parents had the exact same situation in front of their place in Maryland. There was a long straightaway where cars could get up to incredible speeds, and then there was another road on the other side that was really curvy. So not only were cars constantly wrecking or revving their engines or screeching their brakes past their house at all hours, but cars would cut across their lawn to get around that intersection because, they're used to traveling at 50, 60, 70 on that road. They don't want to wait at the intersection. There were cars that would come up on the curb. There were cars that would smash into the mailbox. There was a fatal wreck in front of my parents' place.
Gee.
My father went out and tended to the person as they were dying. So this story just felt so real.
I try to make each of the stories feel somewhat realistic too. It's sort of, I don't think there's a fantastical story there. Not that I'm against those types of stories, but in this collection, everything was a bit real. Everything was like, oh yeah, that could happen.
The slow boiling effect of that character in that situation, and everything he does is understandable. And the responses that he gets from the community are understandable. The consequences are getting wilder. His reactions are getting bigger as he gets frustrated. And of course, he has his own tragedies and traumas to deal with. This is impacting his life really negatively. Just from where it starts and where it ends, I thought was such a great journey. It's one of the longer stories in the collection, but probably my favorite.
Oh, thanks. It's actually one of my favorites as well. The book is called Dread for a reason, because that dread or tension, I think, is so key in horror. It's like when you're on the roller coaster. To some people, the most favorite part is that journey up, that clack, 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 on that first climb. That's almost the most fun. Yeah, the release is great, but that's the scariest part, is that clack, 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 clack. What's going to happen when I get up there? what's the turn going to do? Is it going to just go straight down? Is it going to go to a loop? And so I try to do that in the story with branching out in all stories, is build that dread. And that, I think, is key to any good storytelling, whether it's a movie, a short story, a novel, or a documentary.
Are there any stories that we didn't touch upon that bring to mind a particular memory of working on the field?
There's a story in there called Encounters, where it's about a documentary film producer working for National Geographic, being sent out to scout a story on Bigfoot. And that really happened. And I think I put at the beginning of the story about 90% of what you're going to read is true. You decide which is the 10% I made up. But a lot of what happens in that story did happen. I like that story because, again, a lot of what I actually did on that project is in there in the words. Another story that I really enjoyed writing was Forest for the Trees, which is about these two state troopers who go searching for a missing person in the forest.
Is that one a sequel to the previous story, The Tent? Or are those unrelated?
They're unrelated, but there are elements to each that mingle. The tent is about somebody in a tent hearing noises outside that suddenly become more and more fearful of what's going on. What is outside the tent? Is it a person? Is it a human? And at one point I write, sort of each had their own things to be scared of. If it's just some random person out there, what are they doing circling my tent? That's scary.
It's scarier than an animal that might just be curious. You can scare away an animal. You might not be able to scare away a human. But you can talk to a human, you can't talk to an animal, certainly can't talk to a bear. It was very funny, the tension you created between is it an animal or human and which is worse.
It's up to the reader to decide. And this idea when we go camping, I don't know if you've ever gone camping, but you get into this tent and you feel, oh, I'm in the tent now, I'm okay. And then there is this realization, it's like, wait, that's thinner than like my jeans. It's sort of like this, there is no protection in here if anybody or anything wanted to come at me. And then suddenly camping doesn't become that fun. It becomes scary. So I hope I haven't scared people off of camping.
In Forest for the Trees, as you said, the characters we're following are state troopers. It was so interesting to start with these high status, in control, well-equipped, well-armed characters. They are there to literally control the situation. They're looking for the owner of an abandoned vehicle. They're rescue personnel. They have all the confidence and know-how. When things start to turn, it gets really creepy because their concerns and the things they're witnessing seem more credible because they're state troopers and they know these woods, or they think they know these woods. The way that they lose control is more interesting than just a weekend warrior backpacker who goes out underprepared, gets lost. It's like, oh crap, if these guys are out of their depth, then this is really scary.
Getting lost in the woods is so easy to happen. And if you've ever gotten lost in the woods, there is a moment where you immediately get scared. Suddenly the forest that was like, oh, I'm experiencing nature, I love it, beautiful sort of environment, suddenly becomes a little scary. The other thing I build up is what darkness is like in a forest. It's sort of, I think people forget, there's this moment where it's almost like being in a cave. There's a full canopy and it's a moonless night and you don't have lights. It's almost total dark. You know, you can't see your hand in front of your face. And to hike in that way, that's where they tell you, you know, search and rescue people tell you, don't move. Stay in one spot because you're just going to make matters worse, or you're going to get hurt, you're going to break an ankle, and so forth. I think we're so used to the urban environment or suburban environment where there's lights everywhere. Even like, oh, I'm going outside in the dark. It's like there's a street lamp, there's a light.
Light pollution. It just refracts through the atmosphere. You don't even need to carry a flashlight.
That's exactly it. If it's a cloudy night and you're in the suburbs, the light bounces off the clouds. It makes things brighter. But if you're in the woods and it's a cloudy environment, that makes it darker because there's no light bouncing off the trees up into the sky.
So this collection, Dread, is doing very well. I see it constantly ping-ponging around at the top of various Amazon bestseller lists. You followed it up immediately with another collection, Creep, right?
That's correct. Thanks so much for pointing that out. I appreciate that. Yeah, it's doing really well, and followed up with Creep. Again, I had from May all the way to whatever, October, where the writer's strike was there, and I sat down and tried to write 2,000 to 3,000 words a day. I mean, really sat down from morning till night writing, because I didn't know when the strike was going to end. So wrote Dread, wrote Creep. There's another collection coming out. And Creep is sort of a twist on Dread. Creep looks at the more mundane, when the simple things can suddenly turn and make you question everything.
What project are you working on next?
I'm working on another collection called Cursed. I'm also working on a novel called The Visitor. And I'm working on a documentary on raptors. Those are eagles and falcons, looking at the illegal trade of raptor. And also optioned another screenplay just recently called The Pit, which is sort of a contained horror. So always writing, always working.
Can you give us a little teaser for El Monstruo?
El Monstruo, sure. That's a shark film set in Cuba. El Monstruo was this real shark. If you Google El Monstruo in Cuba, it's considered by some to be like the largest white shark ever caught. The film starts off in the 50s when El Monstruo is caught, takes us into the mid-70s when people were fleeing Cuba in boats, and still do to this day, to come to America. So it's an immigrant story, but it's the terrors and tribulations they have to go through on the boat trip from Cuba to Florida.
Wow. So, Kevin, where can our listeners find you online?
You can find me at Kevin Pangolin on Twitter. I'm on Instagram. I'm on TikTok. I'm always uploading little book trailers and excerpts. So if you want to get a flavor of Dread and Creep, I'm on YouTube. If you Google my name, Kevin, Kevin, Bachar, Bachar, you'll find me. Website, kevinbachar.com. Google my name, you'll find me.
Excellent. Thanks for hanging out, and thanks for sharing Dread with us.
Thanks for having me on. This was a pleasure.
Please subscribe and follow. Links are in the show notes. You can find me at jeffccarter.com and hit the link to pick up my collection, We Bleed Orange and Black, 31 fun-sized tales for Halloween. Until next time, stay spooktacular.
Thank you.